I want to present a puzzle for you today in the form of 3 stories about 3 ordinary Russians. 3 stories that, once you realize how they all fit together, will tell you just about everything you need to know about the Russian economy. In the process, you'll probably learn a lot about your own economy too, and maybe you'll even want to go home and rethink your life. Once you realize how vulnerable a lot of economies really are, when on the surface, especially on the inside, they can look stronger than ever. There's 3 characters for our puzzle today, the first being a Russian plumber, the second being a Russian farmer, and the third being a Russian business owner, all of whom are living in the same war economy in the same country of Russia at the same time, but who are all experiencing life completely differently. Let's start with the Russian plumber. This is a real story about a real plumber, and this one man is representative of a lot of different plumbers and a lot of different trades within Russia. This is a man who, not long ago, was looking to leave the country of Russia, not because he was afraid of the war or afraid of getting drafted, and not because he was unpatriotic, but because he simply could not find enough work. As a plumber, he found that nobody wanted his skills. But then all of a sudden, things changed. And right now he finds himself busier than he's ever been. It seems like the economy is booming and that life has never been better than it is right now. But for that exact reason, this man should probably think about leaving the country more than he ever did, even when he couldn't find work. But why would that possibly be the case? The second story has to do with a Russian farmer, somebody who has a critical job feeding his own country and also feeding many other countries around the world, including countries like those in Africa, who depend on Russian grain imports. This is a man who largely keeps to himself. He lives in the country. He owns a lot of acreage in some very fertile land, because that is what Russia is, a lot of it, especially the parts to the west of the Urals. But lately, this farmer is having a big problem. And next year, he might not plant his crop again. Because simply put, he cannot acquire enough diesel to bring in his crop. Already, he planted his crop with very thin margins, even under the best of circumstances. And now that he's going to be unable to bring in the crop, there's a real question as to whether or not he'll actually bother planting that crop next year and working to lose money. The question is, how could this man possibly be experiencing this at the same time that this plumber is experiencing this massive boom in income? And once you realize how the pieces fit together, you'll realize why the farmer, like the plumber, should probably consider leaving the country if his government will allow him to, which unfortunately for him is almost certainly not the case. Our third character here is a Russian businessman, a man who used to own a prosperous business where he could make a good profit, and he could find workers to work in his business rather easily. Now he's facing a conundrum, though. He can't find anybody willing to work in his company. And that's kind of strange because there's actually a fourth character that I want to introduce here, which is an average Russian woman who finds herself flush with more cash than she's ever had before at any time in her life. She is spending money like crazy, and typically speaking, that spending should be stimulative to the economy. It should be providing this traditional Russian businessman with a lot of opportunities. But the problem is, none of that money seems to be coming to him. Now, each of these characters, the plumber, the farmer, the businessman, and the average Russian woman, are all experiencing the same Russian economy, but they're experiencing it completely differently. For 2 of our characters, the experience is overwhelmingly positive. The plumber with more opportunity than he's ever had, and the Russian woman with more cash than she's ever had, not even needing more opportunity because she just simply doesn't have to work anymore. On the other hand, we have a conundrum. How can that be true for these 2 aspects of society, while the farmer and the businessman have it worse than they've ever had it? And we need to point out something here first. It's important to notice that no one of these characters experiences every aspect of this economy. And in an economy like Russia, that might actually be by design. Nobody in this economy has the full picture. For the most part, the people in this society are going by the ebbs and the flows of their own personal experience. And this is very convenient for Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. Because when people are judging reality by their own personal experience rather than by the big picture, it is easier to manufacture things and to hide things and to make people feel that reality is a certain way when in truth it's just a facade that is about to break down potentially rather violently. That being said, this conundrum that I've posed is a big one if you know anything about economics. Because typically speaking, the things I've mentioned here should largely balance themselves out. Never completely. But in most economies, if there is excess prosperity in one area, those opportunities should flow to those who are lacking prosperity. In this case, the businessman should be able to find plenty of employees that he can afford to pay at a profitable wage because there is so much money and so much opportunity flowing through the economy. He should be able to find workers even, for example, from the sectors that are struggling, like the farming sector. Because if these people cannot find opportunities, well, there are other business opportunities and people who are willing to pay a wage who can't find enough workers. Theoretically, there should be opportunity for everybody. And while I know this is kind of a theoretical scenario, a farmer isn't a perfect match for every business owner, typically speaking, that's the overall function of what you would expect in an economy. But Russia's economy instead is doing something very, very strange. Some people are experiencing the highest highs they've ever experienced, and many others are experiencing the lowest lows. So how can all of this be? And that's what I want to describe for the rest of this video. To answer this question overall, of course it has something to do with the war in Ukraine, as probably everybody watching this video could have guessed before you even clicked on it. But it turns out that's only part of what we're talking about here, and in many ways, it's not even the most interesting part. We're actually talking about something much more fundamental to the Russian economy, an economic disease that they contracted long before this war even started. That economic disease has only been aggravated more and more by the war in new and different ways, as Russia has also simultaneously added additional economic diseases on top of this one. And so the Russian economic body right now has diseases left and right, and it's really decaying even while the body itself is still living. That's obviously unhealthy. And the more diseases you add to a body, the harder it gets for that body to recover, the sicker and the sicker it gets from each individual disease, all of which could be fatal. And the disease we're talking about today may in fact already be terminal. It turns out that this is the same economic disease that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union, at least in part. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the Soviet economy leading up to its collapse looked a lot stronger and healthier than the modern Russian economy currently looks from the same disease. In fact, right now, a lot of people don't realize, but many aspects of the Russian economy are being almost Sovietized again. And there are communistic elements to the way the Russian economy is currently being run, producing many of the same weaknesses that the Soviet communistic economy ultimately experienced. Primarily, the weakness of central control, where a central government body is trying to plan and make the decisions for everybody, rather than allowing economic fundamentals do their work and determine which jobs people pursue and which businesses are actually profitable. Instead, the Russian government is choosing the winners and the losers, and increasingly, they are choosing the wrong ones. What we're going to talk about today is this disease that is named Dutch disease, a chilling disease that the Russians might not be able to recover from. So, let's get into it. Last year was a record-breaking year for gold prices. In February 2025, gold was around $2,900. By February of 2026, that had increased to a peak of over $5,200, an 84% one-year increase. And frankly, it got my attention. I had never seriously considered purchasing gold before, but I wanted to understand the fundamentals behind what was going on, from a geopolitical and a macroeconomic standpoint. And the conclusion I reached personally was that gold was a far more interesting asset class than I had previously given it credit for. Now today, the price of gold has come down from the peak, as things often do after a strong run, to around $4,070 as I'm recording this video. And so a question a lot of people have is whether now is really a good time to buy gold. It's a fair question, but I also think it's the wrong question. The real question is why the price rose in the first place, and whether the fundamental reasons behind why most people purchase gold have actually changed. And I believe answering that question provides a much clearer picture than attempting to speculate where the price of gold might go in the future. I believe the fundamentals are still very much the same. Markets rise and fall. Inflation comes and goes. Governments spend beyond their means. Debt continues to grow, and uncertainty is just part of the landscape. With that in mind, many people are still considering purchasing gold for the same reasons they did 2 years and 2 decades ago. They're purchasing it because they believe it has a role to play in protecting long-term purchasing power and preserving wealth during national or international instability. And if you're like me, you might want to understand your options. For example, you can purchase gold or silver directly, or what less people realize is that you can purchase gold in a tax-advantaged retirement account through something called a gold IRA. For some people, that can make sense as part of their retirement planning, but it can also be very confusing. And that's one reason I appreciate Augusta Precious Metals, the sponsor of today's video. Augusta is keenly focused on education, helping people understand what a gold IRA is and decide for themselves if it makes sense for them. They provide personalized one-on-one educational web conferences with no pressure, just information. And the reason I choose to promote them is because of their reputation in the industry for customer satisfaction, with over 4,000 5-star ratings across trusted review platforms. If you'd like to learn more, it's easy to get started. Just visit paullovesgold.com or text Paul to 35052 to request Augusta's free guide. Again, that's paullovesgold.com or text Paul to 35052 to get Augusta's free guide. Because the question isn't what the price of gold will do now or in the future. It's whether the reasons for owning it have changed. And from where I sit, they haven't. So to understand what's happening to Russia's economy right now and how bad things could really get, I want to start by describing what Dutch disease actually is. Then I want to describe how bad the Russians have actually contracted it. Because it turns out that for the Russians, Dutch disease has metastasized across their entire economic system. And Russia doesn't just have one form of this. They actually have multiple forms in what I like to call tongue-in-cheek double Dutch disease, or more accurately, a Russian nesting doll of Dutch disease, where if you peel back the layers more and more, you keep finding different types of Dutch disease everywhere you look. There is the overall layer, the overall economy, and then there are the microeconomies, the individual cities and towns and counties and regions of Russia, which are all afflicted in different ways. And many of these areas are afflicted with what I would call stage 4 Dutch disease. It is terminal. It will cause some form of economic collapse, at least on a local level in many different parts of Russia. That is almost inevitable. The question is, how can Russia respond to this if they actually do their best and end their war against Ukraine tomorrow? And it turns out, even if they do that, the prognosis is not looking very good because the economic disease has already infected the entire system. So first, what is Dutch disease? And I need to say here at the forefront, this, guys, is not a slight against the Dutch. I always get snide comments whenever I talk about this, but it really is not meant to be rude to the Dutch. It is named after a particular economic situation that faced the Netherlands in the past. Now, if you're from the Netherlands, you should know that since then, the Dutch have resolved their Dutch disease. It's not necessarily fatal. And currently, the Russians have a much worse version than the people of the Netherlands do. And that's because the Netherlands is a democratic country, and they worked to resolve some of these fundamental problems. But Russia, as a dictatorship and an oligarchy, has leaned into their economic problems that are caused by Dutch disease, and they are almost intentionally making them worse. So in the case of the Netherlands, where we get the term Dutch disease, comes from a period of time where the Dutch discovered a massive deposit of natural gas in their shores. And this was huge for the country. It brought all kinds of economic prosperity. But the problem was, as people leaned into this newfound prosperity, it created a lot of vulnerabilities for their economy. Now, having vulnerabilities doesn't mean that those vulnerabilities ever actually get exploited. It just means if you have the vulnerability, you are at risk of a big situation. The Netherlands fixed their vulnerabilities. The Russians are actively making their vulnerabilities worse. The vulnerability happened like this. As more and more people found easy money in the gas fields, other sectors of the Dutch economy became progressively less attractive. And it wasn't just the people who directly were getting money from the gas fields. Actually, perhaps more important than that, it was that the rest of the economy was finding new avenues of easy money by serving the people who were making money from the gas revenues. So, for example, if you are an engineer for an energy company, you might make a very high salary. And with that high salary, you're going to want to buy certain things. You're probably going to want to buy a nice house, a nice car, nice clothing, some luxury goods, and you might even want to take your family out to eat more often. There's all kinds of goods and services that wouldn't have been bought in your economy in so much bulk, but that are now very attractive because there's a lot of people who can afford them. Seeing those opportunities, a lot of people will leave more traditional sectors of employment. In the case of the Netherlands, perhaps manufacturing or agriculture. Because, for example, they might find that working as a restaurant and getting tips from engineers with high salaries can pay them better than working for a manufacturing company. And soon the entire economy becomes retooled around this one sector, this sector that is generating a lot of prosperity. The problem is even worse than this, though, because it turns out that when you have a massive amount of a natural resource that a lot of people want, it creates a demand for your country's currency so that people can purchase that natural resource from you. And when there's a big demand for your currency, it makes your country's currency stronger. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it turns out that having a stronger currency, while it can be good overall for certain reasons, it makes you vulnerable because having a stronger currency makes you less competitive in certain other sectors for complicated reasons that I really can't fully explain in today's video. The long story short, for a sector like manufacturing, it is harder to compete in a country that has a strong currency than it is in a country with a weaker currency. For a lot of reasons, for example, for the fact that in a country with a weaker currency, typically the workers will take less pay, and so overall manufacturing is a lot more affordable. This creates a really big problem for your manufacturing industry. First of all, you're less competitive because your currency is kind of working against that particular type of employment. But second of all, that employment is more expensive than it's ever been before because you're now competing for labor against other sectors where there's easier money. It's not a bad thing for people to have better opportunities in other places. It just can create a vulnerability. And in the case of the Netherlands, the vulnerability is this. What if there's somehow a drop in demand for our natural gas? What if there is some kind of catastrophic disaster with our natural gas? What if for some reason that revenue stops flowing into our country? Well, all of a sudden, since our entire country has built around that one resource, and our economy has been tooled for that, even at a monetary level, it means that all of a sudden we could face economic catastrophe. And so you really want to diversify your economy as much as possible. And even, yes, in some cases have artificial incentives and disincentives to prevent this one sector from gaining too much power. That is ultimately sort of what ended up happening in the Netherlands. So they avoided their biggest vulnerability, and they were able to still profit without going too far. In the case of Russia, though, because they are run by oligarchs, they don't really care about structural vulnerabilities to the whole economy. They care about adding profit to the pockets of the oligarchs. This incentive structure in Russia is what has ultimately brought the Russian economy to the point where it's at today, where they are afflicted with Dutch disease at several different levels. But they have done nothing to mitigate this, because unlike the Dutch, who have implemented systems to avoid Dutch disease, the Russians have intentionally pulled out those stops, because those worked against the goals of their leadership and the people who ultimately hold the power in Russia, which are not the people. So Russia is afflicted with Dutch disease at the national level. That's the first bucket we want to look at, the first layer of the Russian nesting doll of Dutch disease. And this is very similar to the Netherlands. Russia, like the Netherlands, is blessed with abundant natural resources, and it's become their main exports, oil and natural gas. A lot of people know this. We joke about the fact that Russia is a gas station disguised as a country, and that really is true. Think about yourself personally and whether you have ever purchased a product, whether it be a physical product or a software product, that is actually made in Russia, or even a service product for that matter. I'm sure with an audience of my size, we'll find exceptions, but in my experience, when I pose this question or this scenario, there are very few exceptions. For the most part, Russia doesn't produce much in terms of finished goods, finished products that other people consume. They don't have sophisticated manufacturing capabilities, and to the extent they do, it serves their own people, and these are actually inferior products to Western or Chinese alternatives in almost every instance. The Russian economy has never become a high-tech economy for finished goods, and there's a reason for that. It's not just because Russia is so blessed with natural resources, because there are other countries that are blessed with natural resources, and they have not succumbed to the same fate. At the end of the day, this is largely a problem of governance. Natural resource wealth, it turns out, is one of the simplest, not necessarily easy, but one of the simplest forms of wealth to concentrate in the hands of few people. Because the wealth depends on who owns the land and who can force the contracts at, governmental level to allow pipelines and things, the infrastructure, so that the wealth can actually flow through from that. You don't need to really be an entrepreneur. You don't need, for example, to go create a better product than somebody else. If you're trying to create any kind of manufactured product, for example, let's just use a car, for example, or a cell phone or a computer, you don't need to be innovative and you don't need to go out and compete with people who are hungry. All you need to do to control wealth in this type of system is use raw power to control resources and land. And so Russia's oligarchs, because that is the power system in this country, they have focused on resource wealth as their primary area where they get wealth, holding the rest of their country back. In some cases, you could say maybe even on purpose, because they don't want an entrepreneurial vision for their country, like the United States. I know it has its flaws, but they don't want an entrepreneurial vision for their country where somebody even theoretically has the possibility of being a nobody and then rising in power and building some massive company where they can then use their power and their platform and their wealth to challenge the elite. That's the last thing that they want. And so in many ways, they have held back their economy, and they are centralized around this oil and natural gas. That puts them in the same fundamental vulnerability of the Soviet Union for similar but somewhat different reasons. The Soviet Union, for similar reasons, although their lack of entrepreneurship and innovation was a little bit different, also built around oil and natural gas and other similar resources to make their wealth. That was really good when oil prices and energy prices were really high as the world was building a lot of new infrastructure. But then all of a sudden, energy prices collapsed and the Soviet Union collapsed with it because their entire economy depended on that linchpin or that kingpin, whatever the proper word is, of resources in their economy. So Russia is very similar at the national level, and that's really bad because of the war in Ukraine. Yes, there are lots of headlines about the fact that Russia continues to generate revenue from oil and natural gas. That's undeniable. It's also undeniable that it is a lot less than it could be and should be had Russia not invaded Ukraine. Russia is heavily sanctioned, which means a lot of their customers will not buy their oil or natural gas from them directly. They may still buy it through intermediaries like India, but in that case, India is soaking up a lot of the profits that would have gone to Russia. And right now, we see kinetic sanctions happening all the time. Ukraine is now targeting Russia's shadow fleet directly. They're now targeting Russian oil refineries directly. They're now targeting Russian oil export terminals directly, and oil infrastructure in general directly to reduce Russia's oil profits. This is a problem because as the modern Russian economy is built around oil and natural gas exports in real terms, that is going to have repercussions the more that revenue is removed, because the entire economy depends either directly on those revenues or on serving the people who are making those revenues. This is where Russia is at today. Russia has, for example, massive budget deficits. They don't have enough money to make up for what they're spending. And a lot of this is because their revenues are not enough for what they want to spend. And so at a national level, Russia has this Dutch disease that's being triggered, and it's getting worse the longer the war in Ukraine goes on. That did bring down the Soviet Union under, I would argue, more favorable circumstances. It could do the same for Russia today. But that is hardly the most concerning form of Russia's Dutch disease. And so to really see where the problem is and where Russia is stage 4 terminal, we need to look a little bit deeper by going into the next layer of the Russian nesting doll of Dutch disease. To explain these next couple layers of Russian Dutch disease, I want to remind you of the characters I introduced at the beginning of this video. We had our plumber, who has more jobs than ever before. We have our business owner, who is struggling to find workers, despite the fact that some sectors are going out of business because of the war in Ukraine, like the Russian farmers. We also have this average Russian woman, which for some reason is flush with cash. So let's explain all three of these people, starting from the point of this Russian woman who is flush with cash. And let's ask the question, why is she flush with cash? Especially when at a national level, her country's primary way of bringing in income has been so deeply hampered. That shows you that her cash is not real cash. In some way, shape, or form, this is artificial cash. This is stimulus that is coming from the Russian central government, who is deciding who the winners and the losers are so that they can orchestrate their economy around their primary goal, which is the war in Ukraine. So where is this Russian woman getting all this cash? I think a lot of my viewers will have figured this out already. She is getting her cash primarily from the salary of her husband. Or actually, it's not primarily the salary of her husband. Because now the primary way that people are getting money in Russia is through death benefits. So Russian soldiers, when they sign up for the military, they get 3 major forms of income, which are massive, or at least historically that's been the case, before they move towards conscription, which is what they're doing now. But anyways, historically, a Russian soldier signing up has gotten a massive signing bonus. They've also gotten a large salary, which is far higher than they could ever dream of getting in most regions of Russia. And they also get a death bonus if they die on the battlefield, which, as we know at this point, most Russian soldiers who show up at the front line tend to do. And these death benefits now make up 38%. It's probably more because that's actually kind of an old figure, a couple months old, but 38% of all Russian military compensation comes in the form of death benefits now, which means there are a lot of women all across Russia who are spending their husband's money while they're in Ukraine, and a lot of those husbands never come back. These women, flush with cash, are doing unnatural things to their local economies. This is where our plumber comes into the picture. A lot of these war widows, with these massive lump sum one-time payments, are deciding to do something that they never could have even dreamed of. They are actually renovating their homes, making them a little bit nicer. Or in some cases, because in a lot of regions of Siberia, there are not indoor toilets installed in most of the homes. These women are splurging and getting indoor toilets installed in their homes for the first time. The point is they're splurging on their spending, so there are certain categories of Russian workers, which prior to this war were looking to leave the country, who now have more work than they could ever dream of. Now you might think that this is wonderful for a local economy, and it could be under more natural circumstances. But the problem is that these economies are getting this surplus of income while they are losing their workers to the war. The husbands are going and fighting somewhere else. That's bringing a lot of income in. And these people with a lot of income, they want to spend it. And obviously when they want to spend it, they want to spend it on services. Similar to what I said about the Dutch disease phenomenon earlier on. People, when you have a lot of money, what do you want to do? You want to go get a nicer home, a nicer car. You want to eat out more often. You want to hire people to do things around your house for you, whatever the case. And these are all things that are completely unnatural to most local Russian economies. But because these widows have a lot of money, they are willing to pay more than the local employers are willing to pay. And so they are out competing the local employers for their workers. This is putting a lot of traditional sectors out of business because they operated on thin margins in the first place. I presented the farmer problem at the beginning of this video, for example, as a problem that they couldn't find enough diesel to bring in their harvest. And that is actually